Graphite, are you ready?
Hey, thanks very much, Jason. We're really excited to be here at launch to unveil Graphite. Graphite's a professional networking tool that's designed to allow you to systematically move people from contacts to relationships with maximum efficiency. Let's show you how it works. First of all, Graphite learns who's in your network. It syncs multiple address books and social networks, giving you an aggregated and continuously updated view of who you know. Second of all, Graphite learns where you're networking, day in and day out, without you having to tell it everything you do. It monitors multiple inboxes, calendars, phone calls on smartphones, and social networking interactions. Graphite tracks who you're interacting with, in what medium, for how long, and how frequently. In addition, Graphite lets you teach it the relative effectiveness of different activities, because we all know some meetings are killer and some just suck, right? Now that Graphite, the third thing Graphite does is it keeps track of why you're networking, your business goals. Graphite lets you individually or collectively rank the relative importance of different people in your professional network. And because different people have different goals for you, you can set relationship targets for people. Some folks, you're perfectly fine having them to be just a basic contact. Other folks, you want to be actively promoting you, cheerleading for you. Now that Graphite knows who's in your network, where you're networking, and why you're networking, it can go to work for you. By knowing your personal goals and having access to all these data sources, Graphite sort of becomes the eHarmony meets Mint.com for professional networking. Graphite crunches all that data and creates for you a personalized call sheet, an evergreen, prioritized set of recommendations of the people with whom you ought to be networking. Now, the first way that call sheet makes your life a lot better is due to its comprehensiveness. Because Graphite is monitoring all your networks and all your networking, you don't ever have to worry that someone who's important to you is going to fall through the cracks. For instance, you can see here at the top of my call sheet, Graphite's recommending that I get in touch with Ted Mizell. That's actually a pretty good recommendation for me because he's an important guy in my network. He's a former boss of mine, and he's a bigwig in the tech scene in Southern California. And I haven't been in touch with Ted all that much lately. I am actually pretty happy with that recommendation. Even more so, I like the fact that Graphite gives me a visual view of the history of my relationship with Ted over time in a graph. It tracks the ebb and flow of that relationship, so I can see when the relationship was at its peak, and I can see how the relationship has gradually eroded over time because we haven't been in touch that much. Now, a call sheet that does a better job than my memory of knowing who I ought to be interacting with and who's important to me is already going to make me more effective. But the reality is Graphite goes further. And that's because many times a specific context of where you're working actually really should drive who you want to be interacting with. Graphite's call sheet can be contextually filtered to show you in priority order the people who are most important to you relevant to that context. Say I'm going to be in New York next week for meetings. We can filter my call sheet by New York, and it will show me in priority order the people in New York that I ought to be spending time with. Now, there's one other way that Graphite helps you out, and that's imagine, I'm sure this has never happened with any of you, but imagine you're at an airport and maybe your flight got delayed by an hour and a half or so. You probably have the option of pulling out that morning's USA Today that someone shoved under your hotel room door, or you could grab your smartphone, call up Graphite, and see your call sheet and start to turn that delay time into networking time. Here, my call sheet says I ought to be calling Jason. So I'll just hop on the phone and say, hey, Jason, it's John Slade. Thank you very much for inviting Graphite to come present at launch. It was great to be here. We got a ton of great feedback, saw a lot of great companies. Once we're all settled back in down in LA, we'd love to have lunch with you one of these times because we really want to pick your brain on a subject we think you're expert on. How to get Graphite a lot of great publicity on TechCrunch. Actually, that's Graphite. So Graphite keeps track of who you know, where you're networking, and why you're networking with them. And it does that to make you incredibly more effective at turning people from contacts into relationships. Thanks very much.
Okay, panelists.
So I have a question.
Right into the microphone, guys. So
Oh, okay, sorry. I have a question. So I've done sales for about 15, 16 some odd years, and I've used a gazillion different contact management databases, and I found that they're only as good as the variables that you put in to measure the information that you want to get out of it. So how customizable really is your system, and what would encourage me from switching to something that I already use, like Salesforce, for example? How are you going to make that switch?
So there's two things there. First of all, we're actually not encouraging you to switch from Salesforce. We think Salesforce is fantastic at managing things that are in the funnel, right? When you've got an opportunity identified and you're filling out a proposal and you're running it through to getting the business. Salesforce is great at that, Siebel's great at that. We're not trying to compete with that. We're working stuff above the funnel. The building up relationships so you get to the point that you actually have a chance to participate in the deal. So that's first answer. Second one, you don't need to do that. We'll sit on top of these systems and we'll pull your contacts from any or all of those systems and keep an aggregated view of them. And our filters allow you to just search on any of the meta tags that are in there, however you structure your data. So you don't have to worry about putting data in this field or that field. We'll aggregate people according to whatever data format you have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it helps.
Cool. Thanks.
Are you guys trying to solve the issue of who knows who in your network?
Not yet. Today, we're not solving the problem of a connection of mine and a connection of yours. We might do that someday. We want to get out and get user feedback on whether they really think they need that. What we're really about is trying to help users maximize their own networks that they have today. Discovery might come further down the road, but not today.
Yeah, I see a big problem here, which is, I have a Windows phone here, and I'm not plugging it, but they have an option to sort of plug into Facebook. The second I plug into Facebook, I have 1,000 people in my contacts that I don't want to have in my contacts. So a lot of these networks have a lot of noise. I'm really broadcasting out to them. I don't really want to have signals coming back per se. So I would see that as being one problem with the mix of different data sources. The other thing is I live in a cave. I don't want to be told when to speak to people. This seems very dystopian to me, where I'm constantly being tapped on the shoulder by a system to reach out to someone. It's just sort of a first blush. But
why don't I respond to that? I mean, clearly this is a relationship management system, and in our research we talked to hundreds of people who are in enterprise selling, wealth management, commercial real estate, and their job, the cash register rings when they do a good job of relationship management. It's not somebody who's kind of fending off relationships. We found about somewhere between 8 and 10 million people whose real effectiveness is driven by this pre-funnel activity, and they have no transparency at all. So, if we can solve that problem, we believe those 8 to 10 million people will be wildly more effective. And surprisingly, they're spending between 1 and 2 days a week working on those non-transactional relationship building activities and have no way to see how effective they're being.
But to come back to what Andrew's saying, I constantly work with my sales team to focus on 1 or 2 relationships and get those working well rather than how do I manage 300 relationships. I just don't see that as being a plausible scenario.
So let me just put some data out there. I say we talked about 200 people in our target markets. They're typically managing between 2,500 and 5,000 business contacts. And once again, they have no system for doing that. And some portion of those are active in deals, maybe 5 or 10%, but they know if they're not prospecting that big database next quarter, 2 quarters from now, those opportunities won't be in their pipeline.
Yeah, the final comment, on the positive side, I'm always surprised how systems like this do bring out that sort of 5 to 10% of information, the connections, as you say, that you didn't know about. So I guess I'd have to use it to really
one test I'd ask you to do, I don't know if this ever happens to you, I'm looking through my address book to find somebody, and inevitably I stumble across somebody and say, darn it, that's a great person I knew, I've not reached out to that person, and I kind of regret because that person has now gone dormant, right? I mean, that happens to me, maybe you're better than I am in terms of maintaining those relationships, but that happens to me probably once a month. I started kicking myself and I said, we need to have a system that can do this systematically and for large numbers of contacts.
Fair comment.
The other thing, just from a sales perspective, the other thing that might be useful is a lot of times even nowadays, I still have duplicate records. I keep my contacts in a lot of different places, either Google Doc spreadsheets, LinkedIn, Facebook, a lot of times my Facebook friends aren't necessarily my LinkedIn friends and vice versa. Plus, for example, putting in my old school sales hat, I might have a lot of contacts in Salesforce. So I guess my core question is, are you going to allow developers or something like that to have like an open API where you can somehow either integrate all these different systems and or at the same time dedupe them? Or I guess what's the ultimate usefulness for this?
Well, I think the ultimate usefulness really is helping me focus my time.
Yep.
But you know, in order to do that, we're going to need to have some really killer deduping capabilities, right? We don't necessarily want to become the system of record that writes data everywhere, but we want to aggregate data everywhere so that we know that the Bob that's over here is the same Robert that's over here and is the same Robbie that's over here. And we want to make it easy for you to do that intuitively so that you can know that when the algorithm recommends reaching out to Bob, it's also Robert, who's also Robbie.
Great. Let's take a final question here. Shervin, you have one? Okay.
Can I? Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
First, I see the utility for it 100%. Even as a non-salesperson, I kind of forget to stay in touch with some people sometimes. I come down, I live up in the mountains, I come down to San Francisco, I forget who I want to hang out with until I'm here. I fly into New York, I forget who my homies are in New York. I get that utility. One of the things I really like about it is there is no forced symmetry or mutuality in this app. Like, you know, LinkedIn comes down to the haves and the have-nots. You know, you're either connected or you're not, and it creates this false imbalance that really makes it uncomfortable for some people. And the same thing has happened with Facebook a little bit, where you have to come up with your own standard for who's your Facebook friend and who's not. So I like that stuff. I'm actually surprised, like, you've brought up eHarmony. Like, I feel like it could be a good app for chasing ladies. Like, I feel like it could actually be a good app for singles. Like, and I feel like a lot of your target demographic for that app would be in this room right now. So I'm curious. Like, I'm curious where you think this extends. So we've talked about the sales demographic, but like in terms of personal relationships, whether you're friends or potential dating and stuff like that, like what's your perspective on that utility?
So one thing. A couple things. The reason we say eHarmony, we do have a bunch of science behind this system. The chief scientist out of eHarmony is actually helping us do relationship scoring. It's also a micro-event system, so we have the head of machine learning at Caltech, who's coached the ensemble team that won the Netflix prize for performance on micro-scoring. So there is the science behind that. I think what I would say is what we've learned from them is the relationships on a social level are a little bit more random and circuitous. When it's business and purpose driven, it's a lot easier to predict utility, right? And I think longer term we can create larger circles that go into the more nebulous areas of chemistry. This is a utility driven function, and frankly we think that that will drive the ability of people to pay, you know, in terms of a business model in short term.
Dave, you study social networks, having worked at Facebook and Path. What are your thoughts?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I was saying you study the social network, whether it's at Facebook or your new company Path. What do you think?
So one of my questions that I had was, you've said a couple of times that you're focusing on helping people focus their time, and it seems as though the algorithm is more focused on telling you who you're not spending time with, sort of on the margins. And so I'm wondering sort of a little bit more about how the algorithm works. One of the things we know from building Path is that people, you know, have a very, you know, the brain can only handle so many connections at one point in time, which is why you forget people, right? And the focus, focusing on people who are the highest value to you, whether it's personal or professional, is very important. So I'm wondering do those people matter that are on the outer edge, or should you be focusing more time? I think somebody else asked this too. Should you be focusing more time on the inner circle instead?
So remember how we talked about how we monitor where you're networking day in and day out?
Yeah.
That's so that we can keep track of the fact that you've had 10 emails with Jane in the last month. If you've had 10 emails with Jane in the last month, and she could be the most important to you, chances are you probably don't need to be sending her an email right then.
Yeah.
So by monitoring what you're actually doing day in and day out in your calendars, your phone logs, and your inboxes, that actually informs the algorithm, and it comes up with a recommended set of who you're spending time with. So if you're spending a lot of time with someone already, through your calendar, your inbox, your phone calls, or even social networking interactions, you're not going to show up high in that algorithm because the system is believing that you're already making progress on building that.
What if the value of that time is much higher than, you know, than with somebody else?
Sure, the value of time is different between people. So that's where we allow you to look at the events. You're not going to look at all your emails, right? But if you had 5 meetings in the last 3 days that were useful, we're going to allow you to look at that and score the ones that were really great and say those were really great meetings, and score the ones that were really crappy and say they were really crappy, and that will affect the amount of relationship building strength that the algorithm scores accordingly, and then affects the recommendations.
I think the other subtlety is, in business purposes, we're focusing on utility, which is different than social relationships, where I spend time with who I like. Yeah. Not to suggest we shouldn't spend time with people. You know, if I don't like you, I'm not going to do business with you. But it's kind of a bias.
And let's thank Graphite.
Thank you.
Next up